was a busy area with long-distance drivers parking for the night, homeless people begging for money, drug dealers pushing their wares on passersby, and young women offering themselves to suburban fathers and whoever else might come by. The influx of sex workers was so massive that not even the pimps were in control of who came and who went. It's not uncommon for the prostitutes to be killed by a disgruntled pimp, an angry customer, or even an overdose. And the police found the task too big, leaving them with nowhere to go in the hunt for Wendy Lee Caulfield's killer. A month after she was discovered, an angler made another discovery in a river near the main road. While fishing, he caught sight of what he thought was a mannequin. It's never a mannequin. In the murky waters of the Green River. Upon closer inspection, he discovered, to his horror, that the doll was in fact a dead woman. And worse still, another corpse was also present, its hand swaying in the stream as though waving to the fishermen. The police immediately dispatched officers to investigate, where they found yet a third body on the riverbank. With 4 bodies all found in the Green River, the police realized they weren't simply dealing with a one-off murder. That afternoon, they began to hunt for a serial killer. Detective Faye Brooks was given the role of primary investigator in the Green River Task Force. She had grown up in the area and, due to childhood abuse, had come close to ending up as just another one of the many workers on the Pacific Highway. Instead, Brooks chose to pursue a career in law enforcement, and with strong contacts in the criminal underworld, she had the best possible intelligence to identify this killer before he took his next victim. But none of her usual sources seemed to know anything about these murders. The pimps had heard nothing, and the women on the street. There were no rumors of customers who were more perverse, sadistic, or unpleasant than usual. The serial killer had far greater success with his venture than Brooks and her task force. While several plainclothes police officers monitored the Pacific Highway, the killer continued to pick up and murder young sex workers before dumping their bodies along the Green River. During the autumn, police found themselves investigating more than a dozen unsolved prostitute murders without a single vital clue. In an attempt to narrow down the hunt for the killer, police consulted with experts to draw up a criminal profile. The profile stated that the killer was a lonely man who would probably make himself available to the investigation. In mid-September, 2 months after the discovery of the first body, local cab driver Melvin Foster contacted the police. He said that he had known several of these murdered women casually, and had even given some of them a lift, and he wanted to assist with the investigation. Investigators immediately became suspicious. Foster's behavior was so strange, he instantly found himself their prime suspect. But despite lengthy interrogations, the police couldn't find anything to link him to these murders. After he was released, it became apparent that he liked the attention that the local media gave him, as officers shadowed him around the clock. A journalist asked him if he'd killed a woman live on TV, and he replied, "No, but I wish I know who did." Investigators began considering whether the perpetrator may have just served himself up on a silver platter in return for some small screen attention. They intensified their surveillance of Foster, but after months of hard work, Brooks and her colleagues were forced to admit that Foster, despite his strange behavior, was not their killer. 3 more bodies had emerged in the meantime, and these women were killed while Foster was under the keen eye of police. Over the winter, the murders came to a temporary halt, but in April subsequently provided a saliva sample, but it wasn't submitted for DNA analysis due to the lack of confidence in the technology providing accurate results. What? So we just don't submit it? Come on. No further action was taken, and Marie Malvar became just another statistic. Over the summer of 1983, the number of missing workers murdered or missing came to 26. All of them were young women who had only been working in the dangerous environment for a short period of time. The killer appeared to know the Pacific Highway well and only exposed himself to the most vulnerable women, deliberately avoiding the more experienced girls who might prove more than capable of dealing with a dangerous customer. Both young and experienced women feared for their lives. Together they questioned why the police could not find this killer. Rumors began to spread that it was a police officer and that his colleagues were covering it up, understandably. Their anxiety grew daily with good reason. By the spring of 1984, the list of victims totaled 40 women. But then, the killings abruptly stopped. Police knew from experience that only two things were likely to slow down a serial killer. Number one, he died. Or number two, he was apprehended. Investigators turned to examining whether the killer had died in an accident or had been jailed for another crime. This is the wall of deceased women, which is absolutely horrifying. I might want to cover this case in more detail, because I feel like we're not going to talk about the women as much as I want to. Okay, anyway, sorry. I got distracted. Despite the number of victims, the media quickly forgot the Green River killer, and life on the Pacific Highway returned to normal. Faye Brooks and her special task force did not close the case, however. It had gone cold, and members of the task force had other cases to deal with. But from time to time, they returned to the files looking for a new angle on the investigation. Meanwhile, DNA analysis developed further to become a new and extremely effective weapon for those thousands of cases where investigations had ground to a halt. DNA analysis gave the police the ability to effectively link suspects to cases in ways they had previously only been able to dream of. Imagine the difference 40 years later. We are solving so many cases these days, and I think it's amazing. DNA from crime scenes revealed with great certainty whether the same criminal had committed previously unrelated crimes. If the police had obtained DNA from a suspected perpetrator, they now had the opportunity to link them to the crime scene and possibly even the crime itself. I feel like my camera is super blurry today. Anyway. I'm not focused. Sorry, guys. DNA analysis was still very new at this point, and it took a long time to go through old crimes. It was costly in both the procedure itself and the man-hours involved. But slowly, the police began revisiting cold cases. Finally, DNA analysis delivered the breakthrough that Faye Brooks' task force had been waiting for. Forensic scientists had been able to perform analysis on various samples that had been collected at the crime scenes over the years, which included many saliva samples from the suspects in the Green River killings. In 2001, they analyzed DNA found on Marcia Chapman's body. She was one of the two women who had been found in the water of the Green River on the 15th of 19 was in his cell, which he'd found comfortable. He suggested maybe the cell itself was a little hot, but otherwise he was happy to report that he had enjoyed his stay. Oh, he appeared completely unaffected by the situation and seemed so ordinary that the interrogator, an experienced prosecutor named Patty Eakes, had a hard time believing that the police had got the right man. Well, let me tell you what, Ted Bundy was super charming too. However, experience told her that the vast majority of serial killers were in fact quite mundane, except for their crimes. It's this normal behavior that allows them to get away with murder, but beneath the placid surface, madness always lurks. For months, Ridgway stubbornly denied that he was the killer, but as evidence emerged linking him to more of the victims, he suddenly changed his story. After first concocting a tale claiming that he was responsible for half of the murders, in concert with another party, he finally confessed he'd killed all of the women on his own, confessing that he was the Green River Killer. During hours-long interrogations that followed, he began to tell his story. He recounted his shaky relationship with his mother and how he was brought up regarding prostitutes as dirt. The Ridgway family seemed like most others in their sleepy suburb. His father was a bus driver, his mother a homemaker. But inside the home's four walls, conditions were far from normal. His parents argued constantly, and Gary often saw them fighting, or, more precisely, watched his mother get beaten. His father worked most of the time and was rarely at home, but occasionally Gary accompanied him to work. His father angrily told him how horrible and worthless the workers in the neighborhood around the Pacific Highway were, but sometimes he stopped to make use of their services. Gary Ridgway had to wait in the bus while his father sought out one of the women on the street, these same women that he talked so hatefully about. As a boy, Gary was good at sports, but not academics. He was teased and called stupid. His mother scolded him and beat him when he talked about his problems at school. Far into his teens, he wet the bed, and his mother told neighbors and schoolmates about it. When he wet the bed, his mother would drag him to the bathroom, where she stripped off both her and his clothes, and then she would wash him thoroughly with soap and water. You know, down there, I'm not gonna say it. This experience confused his developing sexuality. His mother also liked to show off her own body, so she sunbathed with no clothes or stood unclothed in the bathroom, and he would fantasize about her while also imagining at the same time how he might unalive her. That is creepy, my dude. Ugh. He felt the urge to hurt others and to live out his fantasies. He would occasionally hurt a cat, a squirrel, or another small animal. One day at age 15, Gary spotted a 6-year-old boy rolling around on his own in a playground. Without warning, he pulled out a knife and plunged it into the little boy's stomach. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of power over another person's life. And he loved it. He pulled the knife out, wiped off the blood, and ran away. In Gary Ridgway's eyes, this first assault on another human being was a success. He was never identified as the perpetrator of the crime, which the boy survived. Gary Ridgway finally escaped his family as a 19-year-old when he joined the United States Navy. He was sent to the Philippines, where he enjoyed the services of sex workers in the bars of Manila. But the women disappointed them. He got infected with STDs, and he hated them for it. He now agreed with his father that sex workers were society's worst scum. While in the Navy, Gary married his high school sweetheart, Claudia Barrows, but their marriage only lasted a few years. After their divorce, he married a woman named Marcia Winslow in 1973. love for Marcia was replaced by pure hatred. Gary spent time with his son occasionally, but for the most part, he was alone. During this time, his hatred for women grew, and he frequently paid visits to the Pacific Highway in order to pay. He began to fantasize about unaliving one of the prostitutes, and in July of 1982, he made the dream come true. He picked up Marcia Chapman on the Pacific Highway and took her to a deserted area nearby. After first demanding oral, he then attacked her from behind. As he stood behind her, he placed his forearm around her neck. She screamed for him to stop, but he didn't let go. He applied all of his strength until he heard Marcia Chapman's screams grow weaker and felt her suffocate. As the life ebbed from her, Gary felt satisfaction stronger than anything else he'd ever experienced. He had taken revenge. Revenge on his dominant mother. Revenge on the sex workers who'd infected him. Revenge on his ex-wife who'd left him. He felt satisfaction in every single fiber of his being. But this feeling was short-lived, and just one day later, he began thinking about doing it again. To avoid suspicion on the Pacific Highway, he occasionally picked up a sex worker with whom he would have sex with quickly and reward with gifts and good payments, but only to cover up his almost insatiable sadistic inclinations. Some of the women he subsequently unalived were mutilated while they lay lifeless on the ground. He also found himself occasionally returning to perform on the dead bodies several days or weeks after their murders. Yeah, you're weird, dude. Weird. Sorry, I feel like my camera is so blurry. I don't know if it just can't pick something to focus on. Hopefully you're asleep and it doesn't matter. In 1982 and 1983, Gary's entire life was focused on unaliving. But in 1984, after about 40 murders, he met and fell in love with the divorced Judith Mawson. They moved into his house, got married, and spent their free time on common interests such as music and dancing. Mawson had no idea what her sweetheart had done and what horrors their shared home had been a host to. She didn't know, for example, that Maria Malvar had once laid tied to the bed praying for her life, while Gary stood out in the front yard chatting with the police officer looking for her. Maria did not survive that day in Ridgway's bed, which now the couple shared. Once he was leading a happy suburban life, Gary Ridgway almost forgot about killing. He didn't expect to ever be held accountable for his crimes. What? Gary Ridgway ended up pleading guilty to 49 murders. In court, he received 49 life sentences without the possibility of parole. To escape the death penalty, he agreed to talk and help the police find the remains of the women whose relatives had hoped in vain to see return over the previous 20 years. 49 victims. That's more than Ted Bundy. That is cuckoo. Next, we're going to talk about the Milwaukee Monster. And if you don't know who this is Jeffrey Dahmer. I have never covered Jeffrey Dahmer's case, number one, because a ton of people have done it, and number two, because cannibalism creeps me the F out. I don't know, it just gives me the heaps. I tried to watch the Netflix series on him and literally couldn't make it through the first episode. When he started talking about eating the guy, I was like, and I'm out. And I've never picked it back up. I wanted to learn more about him and his case, but nope. Not the case for your girl. Anyway. police, and soon the trio of men was standing in front of apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments complex. Several locks were released from inside, and a young man with blonde hair, a disheveled mustache, and large glasses opened the door and introduced himself as Jeffrey Dahmer. At first, he seemed calm and accommodating, but when officers asked to come inside, he became panicked and violent. Routh and Mueller had to work together to get the 1.8-meter tall man on the ground and handcuff him. Once Dahmer was pacified on the floor, officers began to look around the apartment. Dotted around the living room were bizarre photographs of men bound, either alive or newly unalived. Other images showed male bodies undergoing various forms of dissection and mutilation. A rotten stench hung in the air, and Mueller followed the smell to the fridge. "Oh my God, there's a head in here," gasped the officer. And he was right. A severed head with an open mouth stared out from a fridge shelf at the policeman. Officers could barely imagine what atrocities must have taken place in this foul-smelling apartment. But the revelations about Jeffrey Dahmer's secret life would only grow even more gruesome. The police had unmasked one of history's most barbaric serial killers, a necrophiliac murderer and a cannibal, who would soon become known to the public as the Milwaukee Monster. In May of 1960, 31 years before he was arrested in his home in the Oxford Apartments, Jeffrey Dahmer was born in the town of West Allis, just outside Milwaukee. His was a typical American middle-class family. His father, a research chemist, his mother, a housewife. Nothing indicated that little Jeff would develop into a cold-blooded serial killer. "I don't know why it started. I don't have any definite answers on that myself," he later explained. According to his father, Lionel Dahmer, Jeffrey was fascinated with death from a very young age. On one occasion, Lionel had discovered a dead animal under the family house, which his son found engrossing. By the age of 10, Jeffrey loved to dissect insects, birds, and small mammals. The boy cycled around the roads near his home to find dead animals he could take home. Some of the carcasses he dissected and immersed in acid to dissolve them. One day, Jeffrey placed a dog skull on a pole in the woods and then nailed the animal's body to a tree. That's horrible. At their home in Bath, Ohio, where the family moved in '68, his parents often argued and their marriage gradually fell apart. These fights took a heavy toll on Jeffrey, who withdrew even more into himself. He became a loner, spending most of his time in the woods or in the shed where he kept a jar of animal parts preserved in formaldehyde. During his high school years, Jeffrey started drinking. The other students in his class noticed he smelled of alcohol and was often drunk during lessons. Classmate Mike Gural described how they'd started talking about his drinking when they were around 17. Jeffrey drank anything he could get his hands on: beer, bourbon, whiskey. It wasn't just social drinking. He drank before, during, and after school. Lionel started to get worried about his son's excessive alcohol consumption, explaining he came home drunk from high school. The drinking got worse and worse, and Lionel tried to talk to him about the dangers, but it seemed like Jeffrey was too addicted, physically and mentally. Jeffrey graduated in 1978, but he was burdened by personal anguish. The now 18-year-old man became aware that he found men attractive, but the teenager knew no one in his town who shared his desires, and his frustration grew. One June night in 1978, Jeffrey had been out drinking, which was far from unusual. His parents were gone for the weekend, so he had borrowed the car. He was on his way home when he noticed a young man standing at the roadside holding out his thumb. He said that he had been having fantasies for a couple smoking, it dawned on Jeffrey that his guest wasn't into men, and he had no intention of fulfilling Dahmer's fantasy. Jeffrey said, "I didn't know how else to keep him there other than to get a barbell and hit him over the head. And then I strangled him." Immediately, Jeffrey was appalled by his actions, but he also felt aroused by having complete control and power over his victim. He then did some stuff that I'm not going to go into, and then carried Stephen to the crawl space and went to bed. The following day, Jeffrey bought a hunting knife, knowing he had to get rid of Stephen before his parents got home. He dismembered him and then hid him. 18-year-old Jeffrey had become a murderer, and he found quite a bit of pleasure in the act. That night in Ohio, that one impulsive night, nothing has been normal since then, he said. After it happened, I thought I would just try to live as normally as possible. But things like that don't stay buried. In December of 1981, Jeffrey moved into his grandmother's basement. Since the murder of Stephen Hicks 3 years earlier, Dahmer had been in the army, but he was thrown out due to alcohol abuse. Now, 21, he was trying to turn his life around. He started going to church with his grandma, reading the Bible, pushing out any sexual thoughts that he had, and for about 2 years, he was doing pretty well. But then he started the compulsion, the drive, these sexual desires, and he started drinking again. Jeffrey Dahmer became a frequent visitor to Milwaukee's gay bars. He got in the habit of inviting casual acquaintances to his home in the basement of his grandmother's house. Here he sedated his guests with sleeping pills, which put them into a coma-like state so he could exploit them. It gave him a sense of total control and increased thrill. He managed to keep his most macabre desires in check and didn't actually kill his victims at first. He reminds me of Joseph Morgan from the Vampire Diaries. I really feel like if they did a biopic on him, Joseph Morgan should play him. Side note. Again, I am so distracted today. Alright. One weekend in September 1987, things went wrong. The now 27-year-old Jeffrey had fallen into conversation with a slightly younger guy named Stephen Toomey. The two agreed to have some fun together in a hotel room where copious amounts of alcohol were consumed. Jeffrey saw his chance to slip 4 or 5 sleeping pills into Toomey's glass. In the morning, when Dahmer opened his eyes, Toomey lay dead by his side. He believed that in his intoxicated state, he had apparently given in to his violent urges. He said that he felt complete shock. He couldn't believe it had happened again after all those years. What? Okay. He rented the hotel room for another night so he could go to the mall and get a large suitcase. With Stephen's body stuffed in the case, he ordered a taxi home to his grandmother's, and the taxi driver was kind enough to help lift the heavy suitcase in and out of the trunk. Whoa, dude, no. Jeffrey put the suitcase in the root cellar and then waited until his grandmother went to church the following Sunday. He then went into the garage where he desecrated Stephen's body. I'm not even getting into all the details. Y'all know him. He threw Toomey's remains in the rubbish shortly before the collectors arrived. After these urges had been suppressed for so many years, Dahmer's urges had reawoken. From then on, it was a craving, a white man was up to. As the years went by and the compulsion became stronger and the obsession more intense, it became the main focus in my life. In his new apartment, Jeffrey gave in to the new macabre urges. He killed his sixth victim, Raymond Smith, as usual, but instead of throwing everything away, he kept the heart and biceps for a special purpose. He cooked pieces of the muscle in a pan. Oh, I can't even read this. Then, while looking at a picture, he ate the flesh, bite by bite, with enormous pleasure. Oh, yuck. That literally gave me the heaves. Eating bits of his victims gradually became a regular ritual for Dahmer if he found the man particularly attractive. He always made sure to have parts of corpses in his freezer so he could eat the meat whenever the craving arose. He also began to keep parts of his victims in jars. He acquired a large blue drum of acid into which he dumped dismembered parts. Slowly the flesh dissolved away, leaving only pale bones. The skulls in particular were regarded by Jeffrey as trophies, in which he hid in drawers and cupboards. The drum of acid stood in the bedroom, where he had plastered the walls with pictures he had taken of his victims. The smell of rotting meat seeped from the apartment into the hallway, where people began to notice. Several times unhappy neighbors knocked on the door of number 213 to complain, but Dahmer politely just said his freezer had broken. The explanation was accepted by his neighbors, and the serial killer was able to continue unhindered. By the spring of 91, Jeffrey had killed more than 10 men. The compulsion to explore the human body to achieve sexual gratification had driven the killer to try new experiments. This is where it gets even more crazy, y'all, if you don't know this case. He began drilling a hole into his victim's skull while they were still alive. He tried to create living zombies with dumping uric acid in the drill. He wanted to have a person under his complete control. Abso-friggin-lutely not. Ugh. Once he had stunned his victims, he took a hand drill and drilled into the brain. Afterwards, he squirted boiling water and hydrochloric acid into the brain, hoping his victims would become some kind of zombie who would carry out simple commands without resistance. No. Unsurprisingly, this was unsuccessful. Some of the guinea pigs woke up after a few hours with an agonizing headache, but soon passed. Hello! He dumped hydrochloric acid in their nugs. On the 27th of May, 1991, Dahmer's 13th victim, 14-year-old Conorak Synthesmophone, was also subjected to the drilling after being sedated and assaulted. While the teenager lay unconscious in the apartment, Jeffrey felt like having a beer, so he went to a nearby kiosk to get himself a six-pack. When he returned to his apartment, he saw this 14-year-old Conorak with two women down the street, apparently asking for help. He was naked. He spoke incoherently, but the women realized he was afraid of the tall man. Dahmer rushed over and grabbed Conorak. But before he could lead his prisoner back to his apartment, the police showed up. The killer, who for once was not inebriated, told the officers that this young man was his lover, who was 19 and had too much to drink during an altercation. And the cops believed him. Dahmer seemed completely sober, and the teen looked drunk. It was no wonder Conorak seemed confused. He was affected by sleeping pills and having a hole drilled in his head. Hello? Because of his hair, the wound wasn't visible, and thanks to the police's mistake, Jeffrey was given free rein to resume his horrific crime. Can you imagine being this kid's family? He gave the boy another injection, and this time it was deadly. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, that was super loud. With the murder of Conorak, the serial killer had reached a point where he couldn't control it anymore, as he later put it. He was completely mad with bloodlust, and by July of 1992, Dahmer's home in Oxford Apartments. The 32-year-old African-American was with friends when he met Jeffrey in front of a mall. Dahmer had invited them all home for a drink. The two of us will buy the drinks and the others can come later, Jeffrey had told Tracy. But unbeknownst to Tracy, the serial killer had given his friends a false address. Tracy had noticed this tension in the apartment, but still sat down on the couch when his host handed him a Budweiser. One beer turned into several, but his friends never arrived, so Tracy suggested he might leave. Barely had he announced his departure when Jeffrey suddenly clicked a handcuff around his wrist. Tracy strongly resisted, managing to avoid the handcuffs locking around the other arm. But his resistance caused Jeffrey to pull out a huge knife. With evil painted across his face, he threatened his guest with the blade. His face completely changed. I wouldn't have recognized him. It was as though the devil himself stood in front of me. Jeffrey moved his guest to the bedroom, where he put on the film The Exorcist 3 while ordering his victim into bed. Tracy was horrified. The room stank, and the walls were covered with pictures of mutilated, blood-covered males. Some of them with hair half dissolved. Threatening him with the knife, Jeffrey suddenly, this is where I turned off the Netflix thing. Dahmer put his ear on Tracy's chest. "I'm gonna eat your heart," he snarled. Knowing he risked ended up looking like a photo on the wall, Tracy took advantage of a second of inattention from his captor. The 32-year-old hit Dahmer in the face, stunning the killer momentarily. He then ran out the front door and down the stairs to North 25th Street. Some way down the road, Edward stopped the patrol car containing officers Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, and shortly afterward, Dahmer was arrested. The apartment was a veritable house of horrors. The place looked like a cross between a torture chamber and a slaughterhouse. In addition to the head in the fridge, the freezer had plastic bags of flesh. One of the bags contained a human heart. Several separate freezer bags stored with a severed head in each. In an urn, a forensic scientist who had been called in found severed hands and male genitalia, while another contained 2 skulls. 5 more skulls appeared in a filing cabinet, and an album of gruesome photos was found in a box. This guy was a wackadoo. In the stinking blue barrel in the bedroom lay 3 partially dissolved male torsos. The discovery of an electric saw left the police in no doubt about how the serial killer had cut up his many victims. Dahmer willingly confessed to his crimes. Murphy's interrogations resulted in 66 hours of footage. Have you guys listened to that? Whew. Dahmer recounted 17 murders of boys and men between the ages of 14 and 33. He admitted he'd killed because murder and mutilation gave him satisfaction and the feeling of having his victims under his complete control. As he said, "I trained myself to view people as objects of potential pleasure instead of people. It sounds callous, and it is, but it's what I did." Jeffrey was diagnosed with several mental illnesses, including borderline personality disorder and schizophrenia. In court, he was found sane at the time of the crimes. The fact that he was driven by morbid sexual thoughts and urges was, according to the psychiatrist and jury, no excuse. Right, get it under control. In February of '92, Jeffrey was sentenced to 15 life sentences, 957 years in prison, for the 15 murders he'd committed in Wisconsin, where the death penalty was abolished. 3 months later, he also received a life sentence for his first murder of Stephen Hicks in Ohio. He wasn't convicted of his second murder of Stephen Toomey in '87. Despite his confession, the police could find no cooperating evidence. It is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted remember, like, how convincing they can be with stuff, if that makes sense. So, anyway, okay. Los Angeles, March 21st, 1967. Charles Manson has served his 7-year sentence for crimes including pimping. The jailer enters the cell to release him. Can you believe we release this man back into society? Anyway. Hey man, I don't want to go. I mean it, complains Manson. Can't you take me back? For 17 of his 32 years, Manson has been behind bars and regards prison as his home. The jailer laughs at his request and continues with his duties. This prisoner is to be handed his possessions and released. No one at Terminal Island Prison dreams that this prisoner will be the mastermind behind some of the most brutal murders in United States history over the next 2 years. Manson picks up his guitar. He has $35 in his pocket, and he spends his first days of freedom on buses looking at the world. It has completely changed in the 7 years since he has been in prison. He sees young men with long hair and a striking, sloppy style of dress. One day, a girl gives him a flower and says, "Love." And he is flabbergasted. Something has happened to society. He has no idea what flower power is about, but he's looking forward to exploring it. In San Francisco, spring of '67, the U.S. is at war in Vietnam. At home, young people are experimenting with marijuana, LSD, and free love. The summer of love has begun. The beginning is difficult. Manson heads north to San Francisco in search of musician gigs. But when he sings his 1950s songs, people shake their heads. The rhythm is too slow, and the lyrics crazy. But he learns quickly, and after a few weeks, he learns a new melody. He likes to play in the park at Berkeley University. The students are happy to listen to his self-written songs, and they respect him. Although he is a good 10 years older than them, he quickly becomes a part of the hippie world and its LSD culture. During his first trip, Manson experiences the crucifixion of Jesus, with himself in the lead role. And he believes the experience. He is Jesus Christ. One day, while strumming his guitar in Berkeley, he meets a young librarian who sympathizes with him. Mary Brunner takes him home to her apartment. "I love you with all my heart," declares the 23-year-old girl. "I love you too, but musician's mansion. Charles Watson, a likable young man, age 23. A few years earlier, he fled from middle-class Texas for a new, exciting life in LA. But that did not go as hoped, and now he's hustling as a dealer. The only thing Charles Watson owns is a 1935 Dodge van. One evening while driving on Sunset Boulevard towards Malibu, he picks up a hitchhiker. This guy says his name is Dennis Wilson, and he really doesn't need to hitchhike, because he has a Ferrari and a Rolls Royce. But the cars have been driven into the ground by a bunch of hippies who live with him. Dennis Wilson is the drummer in the Beach Boys. Charles Watson knows their surf songs, and he's thrilled when the musician invites him home for a cup of coffee. The hippies that he refers to are the Manson family. Wilson became interested in the eccentric with all the girls and let them move into his mansion on Sunset Boulevard. He's promised to help Charles's music career, and in turn, he can amuse himself with the girls. Creep. When Charles Watson walks into the house, Manson is sitting on the floor singing "Beautiful, Beautiful Girl, Ceased to Exist." The girls are his choir. Ceased to exist. Come and tell me that you love me, they sing. Watson is fascinated and become part of the family, and from now on, he is just Tex. Meanwhile, Dennis Wilson is getting sick and tired of this whole menagerie. He calculates that the family has cost him $100,000 in just a few weeks. And that's not, in the very least, the treatment of his own and the girls' STDs. He gets his manager to throw them out. So, one of the girls finds a place where they can stay, and it's a half an hour's drive east of LA. It's a ranch. It's a picture of it right here. Oh, you can't see my finger. Right here. Let me move it. There we go. Okay. The buildings were used years ago as a backdrop for cowboy movies, and now this ranch is in disrepair. Charles persuades the 79-year-old blind George Spahn to let the family move in. The girls can clean up and make themselves useful, promises Manson. But he doesn't care for the strange young men, George Spahn does not care for the strange young men. But when Lynette Fromm offers herself as his mistress, his protests are silent. Evie's trying to get up here. He took the 18-year-old. And now the adventure begins. The days are spent singing and acting out movie scenes. One day Indians, the next cool city types. One day Charles breathes life into a seemingly lifeless bird, and from then on it is clear that he really is Jesus Christ. Oh, give me a break. They've no money. To survive, they plunder supermarket bins for discarded food, and when they gather for dinner, Manson sits high above his disciples, preaching about killing their personalities and being like him. Time doesn't exist. There was no time before man invented it. He philosophizes. Philosophizes. Did I say that right? Philosophizes. Whatever. I'm not fancy. Y'all know. Okay. Therefore, the family has no clocks or calendars. The days float together. The nights go by with joints, LSD, and orgies. When they take LSD together, Manson ensures that his dose is much less than the others, so he can manage their psychedelic experiences. What? The disciples must break free of their parents' conventions. Manson calls it deprogramming. Now, I understand that, but this guy's a lunatic. His tools are hour-long monologues, social the inhabitants of black ghettos. The race war, in which Manson calls Helter Skelter, will end with the extinction of the white race. Only the family will survive because they will go into hiding. And when the war's black victors realize their race lacks the skill to rule the world, the family will be ready, and they will take over. Helter Skelter will begin in a few weeks, predicts Manson. The disciples ask no questions. They are convinced of the accuracy of his prophecy. So they gather large stocks of petrol and food paid for with stolen credit cards. They also steal dozens of cars in which they use to drive around. In Death Valley, in which Manson has told them hides an underground paradise called the Bottomless Pit. So let's see. It gets to June of 69. And he's under pressure. The race war, Helter Skelter, has not happened. His disciples are perplexed, and many of them want to leave. Manson says if they don't take action soon, we'll have to show them how. Record producer Terry Melcher has moved out of his villa on Saleo Drive, and now film director Roman Polanski and his beautiful wife live there. I'm going to move this so you can see kind of. This is the house. Beautiful house. It's a villa. Look like a villa to me. Looks like a mansion to me. Sharon Tate is 26 and she dreams of being an actress, but so far she's only landed some small film roles. But she is married to one of the world's most successful film directors, Roman Polanski, the man behind the horror film Rosemary's Baby. Sharon is pregnant. She's 8 months along, and to pass the time until Roman comes back from filming in London, she has invited over some friends. Roman's scriptwriter friend, Wojciech Frykowski, and his girlfriend, Abigail Folger, who stands to inherit a coffee empire. But she's more concerned with humanitarian work, and they also invited fashion hairdresser Jay Sebring, who is hopelessly in love with pregnant Sharon. August 8th, 1969. It is time for Helter Skelter, says Manson. The target is 150 Saleo Drive. The fact that Melcher has moved means nothing. These victims just need to be white upper class. Darkness has fallen when Charles seeks out Tex. He speaks slowly, as though he's looking for the words. There is a service I want you to do for me tonight. Tex says that Manson can ask him for anything. I want you to drive to the house that Terry Melcher once lived in. Take a couple of the girls. Wipe out everyone in the house as gruesomely as you can, says Manson. He reels off instructions. Put on black clothes, cut the telephone wires, kill everyone, hang them, cut their eyes out, smear the house with bloody slogan. Pigs, rise, helter, skelter. I can't remember everything, says Tex. The girls know what to write. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Tex get into the car. 20-year-old Linda Casaban also goes. She's new to the family and not quite as reliable as the others, but she's the only one with a valid driver's license. They drive into the night, heading for Saleo Drive. Tex stops the car a few meters from the gate that climbs to the villa. He climbs up the telephone pole and cuts the cables. The four of them make their way on their stomachs up the slope and into the garden. At that moment, they hear a car driving down the driveway. Wait here, whispers Tex. He jumps out in front of the car and pulls out his gun. Wojciech, Polanski's friend. "What time is it? Who are you? What do you want?" he asks. "I am the devil, and I am here to do the devil's work. Give me all your money," says Text, kicking him in the head. "One more word and you die." They bind Frykowski's hands in a towel, and then Susan and Patricia search the house. They find 3 other people in the living room. Millionairess Abigail Folger, hairdresser Jay Sebring, and film actress Sharon Tate. Sebring tries to protest. "One more word and you die." Tex begins putting rope around Sharon's neck, but Sebring interrupts again. "Be careful, can't you see she's pregnant?" "I said one more word and you die," Tex shouts, shooting him in the chest. He collapses and Sharon cries, "What are you going to do with us?" "You're going to die," answers Tex. Frykowski breaks free of his towel. "Kill him," Tex shouts to Susan. But Frykowski manages to throw himself at her from behind. He hits and kicks. Susan attacks with a knife and injures him in the leg and chest. Tex tries to shoot but has to stop, so he doesn't hit Susan. Instead, he begins to beat him around the head with the pistol. Frykowski fights his way to the front door and makes it to the garden. "Help me, oh God, help me," he shouts into the night. Tex is on him, stabbing him with the knife again and again. And then he shoots him twice. "She's escaping," shouts Susan from inside. Tex sees Abigail Folger run across the lawn in her nightgown. Patricia reaches her and Abigail stumbles, but she's stronger than Patricia. And then Tex jumps in. "I give up. Do what you want." Tex cuts her throat and then smashes her head with the pistol. That's terrible. I mean, the whole thing's terrible. Oh. Inside, Sharon begs for her life and Susan shows no compassion. "I don't care if you're pregnant. You're going to die." "Kill her," shouts Tex, but Susan cannot. Neither can Patricia, so Tex has to do it. Finally, the girls start to stab her too. They get the towel that Frykowski was tied up with, and they begin painting Manson's slogans to show that this is the work of radical black supremacists. On the front door, they write "pig." Several hours later, they are home at the Spawn Ranch, and Charles is waiting. He looks them in the eye, one at a time, and says, "Do you regret it?" They all answer, "No." "Okay," says Charles, satisfied. "Go to sleep and don't say anything." August 9th, 1969, Roman Polanski's housekeeper arrives at 8:30 a.m. and finds the bodies. Not one LAPD officer has seen anything like it. The house is a battlefield. The 5 victims were killed with several bullets and a total of 102 stab wounds. The media reports on the crime, and at the ranch, Tex and Susan enjoy hearing the news. That evening, Manson sends out a new team, and he goes with them. He seems indecisive. They drive around for hours before he stops the car at 3301 Waverly. It says Leo and Rosemary LaBianca on the door. Manson does not know them. "Relax, sit down and relax," he says as he enters the house. "He only wants money." Right. He explains to them as he ties their hands. He then goes back to the car and instructs his team, Tex, Leslie, and Patricia, and drives away in the car. Meanwhile, Tex stabs Leno 4 times, and the girls take care of Rosemary with 41 stab wounds. Before the murderers escape, Patricia stabs a fork into LaBianca's stomach, and they paint bloody slogans. "Death to pigs," and "Helter Skelter," spelled incorrectly, by the way. The murders paralyze the city with fear. Security firms and weapon dealers experience an unprecedented boom. Los Angeles has 2 police forces, the LAPD and the LASO, who jealously work against each other instead of together. Virginia. Well, you're looking at her. Over the next few days, Susan talks proudly about the family, drugs, helter-skelter, and murder. Virginia memorizes everything and wonders whether or not she should go to the police. It is against the prisoner's code of honor to gossip about a fellow prisoner. But when Susan mentions a list of Hollywood stars that Manson wants to kill, Virginia decides she is going to tell what she knows. July 24th, 1970. On the 8th floor of the Justice Hall, the trial of Charles Manson and his followers, Susan Aikens, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel, finally begins. District Attorney Vincent Buglowski, that's a rough one, knows that he has the guilty parties, but he's still worried because his chain of evidence is thin. There's not much technical evidence, and the motive for the murders is completely incomprehensible. Manson ordered a race war in LA. Moreover, he wasn't actually present when the murders were committed. But Buglowski's task is to prove both that Manson had total control over his disciples and that the disciples killed of their own free will. They are all to be judged. The hearings are part farce with the girls singing or giggling. Every day they wear new miniskirts, for the disciples in the Spawn Ranch have made them for them. Manson smiles diabolically while he waits for the chaos to arrive. He orders Susan to retract her confession. Fortunately, another disciple testifies, Linda, who kept guard at the gate. She is offered immunity for testifying. Until the end, Manson believes the girls will be blamed and he will walk. After the longest trial in American history, the jury has its verdict. The 4 defendants are sentenced to death. Even before the announcement, Charles protests against the jury's right to judge him, and the judge has him removed from the courtroom. After the verdict, Patricia Krenwinkel jumps up. You've just sentenced yourself. Susan Aikens follows suit. You better lock your doors and guard your children. Leslie Van Houten ends with, you blind, stupid people, your children will rise up against you. All 3 are removed from the courtroom. Several of Manson's followers have gathered in front of the courthouse. When the death sentences are known, they shout to the TV cameras, death, that's what you'll all get. Later that year, Tex Watson receives the same sentence. After the murders, he had fled back home to Texas, and he had been extradited to custody in California, and it took some time. Prison is the only home I've ever had, says Manson. He's back where he started, because in '72 they abolished the death penalty. So he was sentenced to life in prison instead. So this little part over here says the family disintegrated. When Charles was imprisoned, disciple Lynette Frome tried to keep the family together, but Manson's magnetic influence waned within a few years. One by one they fell away, and she could not prevent it. In 1975, she decided to put the family back in headlines by assassinating the president. During his visit to Sacramento on September 5th, she suddenly appeared in front of him with a pistol in her hands. The bodyguards disarmed and handcuffed her. She explained to journalists it was a protest against the felling of California redwoods. The family were now environmentalists. She was paroled in 2009 after serving 37 years for her attempt. Susan Aikens served her life sentence and was denied parole despite having cancer. She died in prison in 2009 at age 61. Patricia Krenwinkel was a model prisoner. She repented for her crimes and was denied parole 11 times. Leslie Van Houten was a model prisoner released on parole in 2023 after 16 refusals. Tex Watson is still serving his sentence. He's now a born-again Christian and a priest. He's married and has 3 children. Linda Casaban was the trial's key witness, had severe drug problems after her time in the family. She passed away in 2023 at the age of 73. Mary Brunner, Manson's first girl, left the family and had a son. With Manson, she has a new identity. Sandra Good lived with Lynette for many years. She spent 10 years in prison for sending threatening letters to pollution companies. She's still a Manson disciple. Okay. Charles Manson denied any responsibility for the Tate and LaBianca murders until his death in 2017. He was a cult figure among the young and received more fan mail than any other U.S. prisoner. So, his case is crazy to me because, like I said, he wasn't even there during the murders. He just...
Guys, welcome back to Patreon for another true crime video. I'm gonna just mute my laptop here because I always freaking forget. I had a crazy day today and I'll tell you guys all about it later, but I'm gonna try to jump right in. We're going to talk about the Butcher of Rostov. I know nothing about this case. I don't think. Yeah, I don't do too many overseas cases. I don't know a lot about them either, so. Excuse me, it is only 7:47 and I could totally go to bed right now. Alright, let's see. Psychiatrist Alexander Bukanovsky confidently strode down the prison corridor. Soon he would be meeting the prisoner for the first time, but he already knew him extremely well. In Bukanovsky's folder was a 65-page profile of the killer in which the psychiatrist had prepared. Everything was described in intimate detail. The prisoner was impotent, a perverted, sadist, middle-aged man living a double life as both a respectable citizen and a brutal killer. There was only one piece of information missing from this document: the name of the prisoner himself. The report was written before the identity of the killer was known. But thanks to Bukanovsky's work, the criminal had nevertheless been apprehended. It is now well known that the worst serial killer in Russia's history was called Andrei Chikatilo. Chikatilo. I am probably messing that whole name up. The hunt for Andrei began on the 27th of June, 1982, in a village near the town of Rostov-on-Don, which was then in the Soviet Union. Police found the body of a 13-year-old girl. Oh my gosh, these names. Lubov Birkyuk. Investigators could immediately see that this was not the typical murder case. The girl had been both struck on the head and stabbed a total of 22 times. The assaults were too deliberate for the perpetrator to have just lashed out in drunkenness or rage. As a sadistic parting gift, the killer had even cut out the girl's eyes. There's a superstition that says the last thing you see before you die is burned into your retinas. By cutting out her eyes, the killer had taken his own selfie. The police didn't immediately have any evidence, but locals provided plenty of gossip. The murder was a part of a ritual committed by a satanic cult, which sacrificed children to the powers of darkness. Lubov, how do you say? Lyubov. Lubov. I'm sure that it's some like something like Saoirse, crazy. I'm sorry, I should have looked it up. Lobov had fallen into the hands of a gang of organ thieves who wanted to sell her liver, kidney, and eyes on the black market, or a group of boys from the local home for children with mental health issues was behind it. However, none of the imaginative tips led to anything. And while police were wasting time investigating, more corpses showed up. By 1982, August, the investigation was dealing with a total of 6. A serial killer was involved. All 6 victims, 2 boys and 4 girls, were between 9 and 18 years old. They had all been found in bushes near bus or train stations around Rostov. Their mouths had been filled with earth to stop their cries. The killer had inflicted dozens of stab wounds on them and subsequently mutilated them and removed organs from their bodies. Despite the violence of the crimes, however, he'd made little effort to hide his victims. Moreover, the police knew they were chasing a man. At most of the crime scenes, police found semen. But in the time before DNA analysis, bodily fluids could only lead investigators to the offender's blood type, AB, which left them with several thousand possible culprits. Apparently, there were no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious prior to the 6 murders. But in December, the police got a breakthrough. 10-year-old Olga Stalmachuk boarded a bus to go home, but never arrived. Instead, she was found dead, with more than 50 stab wounds, and her abdomen cut open. A middle-aged man had been seen gripping Olga's hand earlier, pulling her towards the forest, where her body was later discovered. The witness couldn't give more details, but now the police in the providential town had a real clue. A murderous maniac was at large, and there was no indication that his bloodlust was quenched. He had to be stopped as soon as possible. This would require specialist murder investigators, so the local police contacted Moscow for help. The authorities in Moscow sent experienced police commissioner Mikhail Feistov and a team of 10 investigators, including the well-known forensic scientist Viktor Barakov, who had found crucial evidence in hundreds of murder cases. The special unit was ready for the next murder, but nothing happened. For months, there were no new reports of killings and no fresh clues. Had he escaped? Had he taken his own life? The answer came in June of 1983, when the battered body of 15-year-old Laura Sarkisian was found near a railway platform, 60 kilometers from Rostov. results, 245 SAs, as a result of the hunt for this serial killer. For some suspects, the pressure was just too great. 4 people unalived themselves after being questioned by the special unit. However, the killer who the team really wanted to catch was proving impossible to track down, and he was still busy with his terrible crimes. As the police worked their way through their list of convicted offenders and the murders continued, it became quite clear that the killer's profile needed to be tweaked. Then the police caught a break when 10-year-old Dmitry Pashinov went missing in Novoshaktsin. Oh my gosh, too many letters. 40 kilometers from Rostov. Witnesses reported seeing a man luring the boy away from a stamp kiosk. Witnesses gave a good description of the man, and when police found the boy's abused body a few days later, they also discovered a footprint in the mud. With a blood type, a description, and a footprint, they had a better chance of catching their killer. The months passed and the murders continued under the noses of some of the Soviet Union's finest investigators. The list now numbered 23. Hundreds of police officers worked around the clock on Operation Forest Path, the code name for the hunt for the serial killer. In September 1984, the strategy of letting plainclothes officers wander around bus and train stations finally bore fruit. 2 officers spotted a suspicious man at the Rostov bus station. He was apparently trying to rub himself against random single women. Creep. So the officers followed him. Was he just a sick simpleton? Or could he be the deranged killer? They decided to arrest him. He put up no resistance and went with them to the police station. He told them his name was Andrei Chikatilo. Chikatilo matched the serial killer's description, and when the police searched his bag, they found rope and a knife. Were they sitting here with the murderous maniac? The police took a blood sample from Chikatilo to see if his type matched the semen analysis, and while he was in custody, they looked into his life. Chikatilo was born in Ukraine in 1936. As a young man, he moved to Rostov, where he took a university degree in Russian literature and linguistics. Since then, he taught Russian at several schools. He was married with 2 children, and he was a member of the Communist Party. Nothing fit the police profile of the killer, but Chikatilo had previously been a suspect in a murder case. In December of 1978, the body of 9-year-old Elissa Zatanova was found not far from a cabin that Chikatilo owned at the time. And exactly like the serial killer's other victims, she had been seriously abused. Police found semen on her, and witnesses had seen a man who looked like Chikatilo near the crime scene. He even had traces of blood on his clothes. Nevertheless, the police at this time decided that the family man was not the offender. What? Ugh. Alexander Kravchenko, confessed to the crime and was sentenced to death for this murder. The fact that Chikatilo was now a suspect in a similar case was just apparently a coincidence. I don't think so. His blood type was A and didn't match the blood type from the semen samples. Moreover, his wife, Fedosha
Fedosha could testify Andrei Chikatilo was at home on the day that the serial killer had been seen in Novoshakhtin, in that one town. Yeah. However, police discovered that a former employer had accused Chikatilo of theft, and after legal proceedings, the charge led him to receiving a short prison sentence. But 3 months after the arrest, he was free again. Now, whether Fedosha was protecting her husband or she really didn't know about his misdeeds is uncertain. But the alibi that she provided allowed Chikatilo to continue killing. With the same sadistic violence as before, he resumed the assaults after a few months' break in the summer of 1984. Police could only look in on despair as new victims of the Butcher of Rostov emerged. The special unit decided they had to go back and start the investigation all over again. Every known SA offender and homosexual was questioned again. 15 lawyers and 30 investigators were given the sole task of capturing the Butcher of Rostov. Several young female officers in plain clothes were sent to roam bus and train stations with the hopes of luring in the killer. Forensic scientist Viktor Burakov, sorry, I added an R where there wasn't one, who was part of the special unit, also decided to involve another expert. For the first time in the hunt for a serial killer in the Soviet Union, a psychiatrist would be asked to compile minimizing it. On the 6th of November, a plain-clothed officer at a railway station in the small town of Donclassos saw something suspicious. A man came out of the wood near the station and climbed up onto the platform. He was well-dressed, certainly not outfitted for mushroom hunting. When the officer went up to the suspicious person and asked to see his papers, he noted that the man had a fresh wound on his finger. In fact, it looked as though the finger had been bitten and the nail torn off. However, his papers were in order, and the officer saw no reason to detain him. Only when the serial killer's next victim, 22-year-old Svetlana Korostik, was found a week later in the woods by the station did it dawn on the officer that he might have been face-to-face with the butcher of Rostov. Fortunately, the officer had made note of the suspect's name, Andrei Chikatilo. To find out whether Chikatilo was really the killer, the police began intense surveillance while also digging into his past. They discovered he had been charged with sexual offenses twice before. Conversations with principals at 2 schools where he'd previously worked reinforced their suspicions. The school heads both said they'd forced him to resign after cases of SA against the students. What? Chikatilo did not realize he was being watched. He drove around bus and train stations looking for his next victim. He was trying to make contact with women and children who were on their own. And on the 20th of November, the head of the investigation, Fedosov, decided he had seen enough. Chikatilo had to be apprehended. 4 plainclothed officers arrested him, just as he was trying to lure a child toward him in a park near his house. Chikatilo denied any knowledge of the killings when he was interrogated at the station. A doctor found that the wound on his finger stemmed from a human bite. And in Chikatilo's bag, they found rope and a knife, got some gratification. I'm not going to say that because I don't know what YouTube will think. He threatened her not to tell, but he remembered the assault with pleasure. After primary school and military service, he moved away from his childhood memories in Ukraine, trained as a teacher in Russia. There he met Fedosha, whom he married, and despite his impotence, had 2 children with. But not everything was so conventional. Chikatilo couldn't keep his hands off the children he taught, and time again had to seek a new job when his violations were discovered. But no one thought of reporting him, so Chikatilo continued. In 78, he committed his first murder. He admitted to Bukanovsky he was the killer of 9-year-old Yelena Zatanova, whose death he was arrested for at the time, the murder for which Alexander Kravchenko was executed. He also admitted to being behind the killing in 1984 when he was saved by his wife's testimony, but he maintained that all of his crimes were society's fault. As the months passed and the prosecution discovered Chikatilo was responsible for 53 murders, in April of 1992 his trial began. The case got a lot of media attention, and newspapers, radio, and TV reported Chikatilo's atrocities in detail. His defense failed, and after a chaotic trial in which relatives of those killed threatened him from the gallery, Chikatilo was sentenced to death. On the 14th of February, the story of the butcher of Rostov ended. Chikatilo escaped having to endure the horrors from which he subjected his victims, and he was executed via a single gunshot. That's terrible. Now, I know this one. Sarah ASMR, I love her channel. I wish she would come back. Covered this, the chessboard killer, Alexander Pichushkin. So we'll cover this one, and then let's see how long it is. Oh, fairly long. Okay, I'm gonna stop here, and we will cover Alexander Pichushkin.